Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I am going to be doing the last in my series of reading 2022 literary awards shortlists. I will leave a link to the playlist where I read various different shortlists this year. I've read the Women's Prize, the Booker Prize, the Jack Prize, so you can check them out in the cards up above. And today I'm going to be reading the Baillie Gifford Prize shortlist. So the Baillie Gifford Prize is a prize for non-fiction, for the best non-fiction in 2022, which is obviously a really broad genre. So I'm going to introduce you to the books and then I will get started with the reading. So we have My Fourth Time We Drowned by Sally Hayden, seeking refuge in the world's deadliest migration route. And this is the story of Sally's experience as a journalist who was writing about the Mediterranean migrant crossing route, the refugees who experienced that, and also their experience of Libyan detention and various other detention centres throughout mostly Africa, including Libya and Rwanda. And a look at the EU's policy relating to migrants crossing and the various sort of UN agencies who are supposed to be helping refugees. Different realm altogether, we have Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne by Katherine Rundell. And I have heard of Katherine Rundell because she is a children's author, but I didn't know she also wrote non-fiction. So this is her biography of John Donne, who was a writer in the 16th and 17th centuries. But it is another one that has loads of quotes on the back, including Maggie O'Farrell, who says, "A wonderful, joyous piece of work with fierce, interrogative intelligence." And the final one I have in physical copy is The Escape Artist by Jonathan Freedland, the man who broke out of Auschwitz to warn the world. And so this is a biography of Rudolf Weber, who was a young Jewish man taken to Auschwitz by the Nazis and who ended up escaping from Auschwitz and trying to tell the world what was going on. And he famously had a very good memory, so he could remember numbers of people and exactly the layout of Auschwitz, and also his experience of trying to warn the world and the ways that people reacted to his information. Also on the list we have Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire by Caroline Elkins. And this is a historical book about the British Empire and the violence inherent in the British Empire committed against various different people who were colonised by the country. Caroline is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who wrote another book about the British Empire, which was specifically about Kenya and the Mau Mau Rebellion. But this is the pervasive use of violence throughout the 20th century and how these practices were exported, modified and institutionalised in colonies around the globe. Another history book on the shortlist is The Restless Republic by Anna Keay, Britain Without a Crown. And this is specifically looking at the 11 years between the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the reinstation of Charles II in 1660. Kind of a straightforward history book by the sounds of things. And then the final book is a biography, and this is A Fortunate Woman, A Country Doctor's Story by Polly Moorland. And this tells the story of one GP in a rural English practice during the pandemic, before and during the pandemic. And it is based on another book called A Fortunate Man, which was about a GP in the middle of the 20th century and his experience, and so kind of looks at the differences in GPs' practices over the course of the last half a century. So those are the 6 books that I'm going to be reading over the course of this vlog, and I will get back to you when I've read something. I kind of told myself that I wouldn't turn up in this video looking a mess, but sometimes illness makes that happen. I have begun The Escape Artist by Jonathan Freedland. If I don't talk to you about it now, I'm going to end up finishing the book without having given you any initial thoughts or anything. So I'm at part 2, the camp I've just started, and this, The Escape Artist, is about Walter Rosenberg, was originally his name, and he was like very fond of escaping from the authorities. Various different times he was arrested for the crime of being Jewish. Sort of a bit about his original life, and then we're into the camp and his escape and everything. It is written like fiction, almost, like it's a biography, I suppose, but it's very sort of narrative, and it's based on what Jonathan Freedland was told about Rudolf Weber's life from his 2 wives, his first wife and his second wife. The writing itself, though, isn't much to write home about. I think it's often trying to not shock you, but it has like these mic drop moments, I guess you could call them, that feel very predictable. So it's not quite doing the job of dropping the mic. The story itself is fascinating about how he escaped, and obviously it's horrifying about what was going on first in a concentration camp and then in a death camp, because he ends up in Auschwitz. The style of writing itself I don't think is particularly special. It doesn't feel like journalistic like when I read last year's and I read Patrick Radden Keefe. I don't know, I'll keep going. It's hard to critique someone's life, particularly someone's life who's as hard as this life. It feels odd, but I'm not critiquing the life, I'm critiquing the writing. So I'm in my spare room, which you may recognise this colour if you've been here a while, because I used to film in here before my office was Office C, and I forgot that in winter the white balance goes funny and I look purple. I'm not actually purple. Let me see if I can fix that. I don't know if I fixed it. I might just get progressively more purple as time goes on. Anyway, yeah, purple. Okay, so I have finished The Escape Artist by Jonathan Freedland. I enjoyed some aspects of this book and I didn't enjoy others. I think that the story itself of Rudolf Werber is a very interesting story of the man who broke out of Auschwitz, and there is a lot of it dedicated to his experience at Auschwitz, which I understand. But I found the story of him like breaking out, and also particularly of his life after Auschwitz, much more interesting. And I think because you couldn't tell this story without talking about Auschwitz, but the experience in Auschwitz is the thing that has been most focused on in general history, for obvious reasons. But he talks about in the end how Rudolf Werber had been like reduced to Auschwitz, and that had been like something that upset him, that he was like more than that, but also his attempt to warn the Jewish people about what was going on in Auschwitz, and the way that he felt like betrayed by the Jewish leaders for various different reasons, and also his belief that like the Allies would help, and then his discovery of how much the Allies actually knew and why they didn't actually help, and the anti-Semitism of some of that, part of the reason for that. But anyway, I found all of that much more compelling and more interesting, and like the analysis there, his working on the trials, the Nuremberg trials, I thought was much more interesting than the recitation of facts of his day-to-day life in Auschwitz. And I understand why that was in here, and obviously it needed to be in here, but that analysis and the later parts was saying something new and different, whereas the life in Auschwitz obviously couldn't have been avoided, but is well known, is well publicised now. Obviously he talks about the 50s and 60s and like Holocaust denial and stuff, which I think was important to mention, but I really did find that much more interesting, and I wish that there had been more of a focus on that. I also found myself like mentally rewriting some of the sentences, like just on a sentence to sentence level. It's a little clumsy, and there are stuff that's like over explained and unnecessary, and kind of hitting the beating a dead horse kind of with just the style of writing. Like he'll explain something and then explain it again and then for a third time just to make sure it's really got home, which felt like excessive and unnecessary, as I was saying. I just wish that the style of writing had been more my style, and that maybe the focus or the perspective had been different. I think this could have been told in a more interesting way than just the linear chronology. I think there could have been more analysis, and yeah, I would have preferred it if it was a little more interestingly told. I am about 30% of the way through The Restless Republic, which is, sorry, I can't remember who it's by. My library holds are taking ages to come in at the moment, so I am listening to the audiobook for this, Keay, and it is about the interregnum. So it starts before the execution, like with his imprisonment and how they led up to deciding to execute him. And she's telling it from the perspective of various different people who lived during this time, so we get a little bit about their lives and their personalities and everything, and also what happened to them and kind of their involvement in various parts. So we've had the guy who was appointed to be like a judge kind of Charles during the attempted trial, to say he'd committed treason, and then there was also a woman who was involved in Charles II attempting to like reclaim the throne with Scottish army, with the Scottish army. Oliver Cromwell hasn't yet made himself Grand Dictator, or whatever his actual title was. It is giving a sense of the time period, but because she's involving people who are involved with the crown, it isn't like the everyday person. It is all mostly like the well-off, because that's who we have the sources for. Interesting enough, and I'm finding the writing fairly compelling, but I don't know if it's my personal favourite type of history. I don't know. I do enjoy this period of history. I think the 17th century in Europe was a big time of upheaval, and so it is interesting to read that time of upheaval. It's strange reading this sort of narrative history, because it feels like it's not as intimate or detailed as fiction would be set in the same period, because she's only writing what can be confirmed about these people, or what has been said about these people, rather than like fictionalizing their internal lives. But it's also not as analytical and talking about the sources and judging the sources and like explaining all of the different machinations. It's very straightforward in terms of its telling this narrative history, rather than exploring our ideas of the history and the ways the history was written and stuff, which I think is what I prefer for non-fiction, in terms of historical non-fiction anyway. So I have finished reading The Restless Republic, and I think it's made me consider the kinds of history writing that I like to read, because I am interested in history. I do like to read about that sort of thing. You know, I like to read historical fiction, so obviously history non-fiction is also an area of interest for me, and the 17th century in particular is an area of interest for me. So you'd think that this kind of interregnum and how the fall of the king happened, and what led to like the attempt to build a different kind of country, a kind of country that like didn't really exist in Europe at the time, and how it failed and how it fell down. Those topics are of interest to me, but I didn't really love this book. Like, it was easy to read. I did listen to the audiobook, but I didn't find it difficult to follow it in any way. It wasn't like clunky or annoying in the way that one of the other books has been. It was fine. It was like very accomplishedly done, but it wasn't the kind of history writing that I am personally interested in. It was just kind of telling the story from various different perspectives of what happened over the course of these 11 years. It didn't really go into any detail saying like, some people at the time spoke about this, but there was this as contrast. For example, when it was talking about Ireland, it did talk about like brutal repression of the Irish by Oliver Cromwell and his army, but it didn't really, there was nothing from the Irish perspective or talking about it from a different perspective than just this is what happened. And I would prefer like looking at different ideas and different like analysis of causality, potential reasoning for things. I felt like it was very much a straightforward narrative history. One of the people was a newspaperman, he was kind of satirical, kind of a private eye style newspaperman, but she was more interested in him as a person than she was in the way that this society was changing to allow for this kind of satire and this kind of humour that had been only the like object of fools before, or the way that print had changed the way that the propaganda was done in this time period, and the rising rates of literacy and how that affected propaganda and the way people viewed the war. I don't know, I think there could have been a lot more analysis, and as it was just a pretty straightforward narrative, and I think that for me that's not really that interesting. So I think if you knew nothing about this time period, because when she was talking about things I would remember things that I'd done 10 years ago during my A-levels about this time period, if you knew nothing about it, it might be a good introduction, and it definitely makes a coherent narrative out of the soup of history. But I would like more discussion of the soup of history, really, and some more sort of murkiness, some more questioning. I don't need people to come to any conclusions. And I remember reading Leah Upi's book in this same video last year, which again was narrative, but I think because it was memoir, there was less of that. But there were like these hints of something else, and like it wasn't so straightforward. It could be read on multiple levels as to what was going on, and I want more complexity in my history, generally speaking. I have begun A Lucky Woman, what is it called? A Fortunate Woman, which is based on an older book called A Fortunate Man, which followed a GP in the 1960s or 50s in this same village, and now we're following a female GP in the 2010s, 2020s. Kind of knew about this guy, and we hear about her past and how she got into it, and various different like anecdotes with her people that she's working with. The writing itself is quite lovely. It's kind of a very like Sunday afternoon kind of read, and it's quite sweet, and the description of the landscape is quite nice, but it is just a bit like insipid and a bit sweet so far. I really hope that it goes into like issues with the NHS and how that's affecting GPs and affecting our access to GPs. It is talking about like the importance of continuity of care, but it's not really talking about like the politics of it or the reasoning for the lack of that. It's kind of settling it as one woman and one man's like individual choices and how they affect what they do and like their personal decisions, and it's not really situating it in the larger setting of the NHS and of money and like funding crisis and how that has changed. It does talk a bit about like the change from paternalism to a more individual focused, like working with the patient way of looking at things. But I do wish it would talk more about illness and chronic illness. Everything so far has been like babies, old people, which is kind of chronic illness, but more sort of acute illness, and I guess that's more her day-to-day, how you don't see people in their like healthy years as often, and I wish it would talk more about like chronic illness and the treatment of chronic illness, and disability and things, because those things haven't been written about at all, which I think is kind of a big illusion if you're talking about healthcare. To be just not talking about disability feels like you're missing out a huge chunk. So yeah, I hope it gets more political. I hope it gets more disabled and disability rep in here, even more like feminism, because it kind of turned feminism into an axe to grind at one point, and I'm not really sure what it meant by that. So far it's just nice, and I would recommend it for like your grandma, but we'll see if it gets any more interesting than that as we go along. I am editing this video now and realised I hadn't wrapped up A Fortunate Woman by Polly Moorland, so I'm here to do that now, but it has been a while since I read it, so I'm going to do my best. I thought this book was fine. It was really well written, really lovely writing, beautiful nature writing, very evocative. I could really see everything, every moment, and I thought that the doctor's character was really well evoked. I felt like she felt like a very real character, a very real person. It did feel very flattering, a very flattering portrait of a doctor, but I can kind of understand that because of the intimate nature of interviewing this one person for a considerable period of time. You don't exactly want to be rude about them, particularly if you did like them and get on with them. So I can see where that comes from, but it was a little sycophantic, I think. Not sycophantic, that's probably taking it too far. Very friendly. It was very, very friendly. Aside from that, it didn't really offer anything, and I felt like it was purposefully avoiding important conversations. It talked a little bit about the rise of part-time hours for GPs and people's complaints about that because of the lengthening of waiting times for GPs and the reduction in services, the 7-minute appointment times and all that sort of thing. Didn't really touch on politics and finance and how that has changed the role of the GP, the underfunding of the NHS and the targets-driven nature of the GP. I mean, it talks a bit about how this particular GP is more like focused on end-to-end care and does things outside of her hours and in her community to make sure that her care is the best it can possibly be. She knows more about her patients than may be possible in other practices, but it doesn't really talk about how that's not compensated, and the reason why a lot of GPs can't do that is they can't afford to do that. It talked about COVID and the effects of COVID, but it didn't talk about like the effects of class in relation to COVID or anything else. It just was like, oh, COVID happened and that was really tough for GPs, and really tough for the community that she lived in. It didn't really talk, I guess it was mostly before COVID, so I guess it was written probably whilst we were still in the thick of the pandemic. But yeah, it just felt like it was avoiding those conversations that you feel like would be obvious for something about a GP, like talking about it didn't mention the NHS really, and so it didn't talk about politics at all. I felt like it would be a lovely book to give your gran. I'm sure that they would enjoy it. It felt like a Sunday afternoon television book. It's just focusing on the individual and it's not looking at the systems or society around it, and so for me, yeah, it ended up feeling a little insipid. I am gonna go finish editing this, and I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Hello. So it is 8 in the morning, but if I turn the lights off now, it's quite dark. Oh, you can still see me, but I think that's better. Anyway, I am halfway through Super Infinite by Katherine Rundell, and the winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize was announced last night. But I am trying to avoid spoilers, so I don't know who's won yet. But I am going to, try and avoid spoilers because I've still got to finish this 3 books. So Katherine Rundell, Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne. And this is a biography of John Donne, who is a 16th, 17th century poet and a preacher and a man involved in politics at the time. I knew very little about John Donne. I'd heard the name and I had heard one of the poems, and I can't remember which one it was, but I've heard some of the poetry. But yeah, I didn't know much about him at all, so I wasn't particularly interested in this book. However, I'm really enjoying it. I don't read a lot of biographies, but I am enjoying this one. I'm really enjoying Katherine Rundell's writing. I think out of all of the ones that I have read so far, her writing is the one that I appreciate the most. It flows well. You can feel the sort of character of the author coming through. There's like jokes and beauty in the writing itself. An effort has been made to make the writing good, as well as the story that is being told. Whereas with the ones that I have already talked to you about, like Escape from the Escape Artist, the writing itself was just very straightforward, and it didn't feel like their writing was of consideration, but it definitely feels like it is. I don't in this one, and I don't know if that's because it's a biography of an author, so there is an attempt to make the writing, or if Katherine Rundell is just this is just how she writes, and I like it. But I know Katherine Rundell is also, I know the name from her as a children's writer, a middle grade writer. I've definitely seen her when I used to work in the library. Her books were popular. So that is intriguing me to maybe pick up some of her middle grades. He's an interesting character, and as you may know, the 16th century is an area of interest for me. It is also interesting to read this after having read The Restless Republic, because The Restless Republic is like the next time period on. So this is like the end of Elizabeth the First and the beginning of James the First, and that kind of changeover from the end of the Tudor period, and then the Restless Republic is about after the Civil War. So there's like connections between the two in terms of the historical time period. But yeah, I'm definitely preferring this one. It's not told in any different, like it's a chronological tale of his time period with his writings put in and the ways that his writings can allow us to explore his life and things. But yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm surprised by how much I'm enjoying it, but I definitely am enjoying it. This is going to have been kind of a not a super interesting vlog, I think, in terms of b-roll and what I've been doing outside of reading. I am not well at the moment. Not well today, not well for the past 6 or 7 weeks, but it's been bad this weekend, so I don't think I've talked to you at all this weekend. I was going on a cycle, maybe I talked to you then, but I don't think I've talked to you about anything else I've done, because mostly it's been not a lot. But I finished Super Infinite by Katherine Rundell about John Donne, and I don't really think I have that much to add since I talked to you about it when I was halfway through. I know very little about John Donne, and this still managed to be interesting despite that, and quite engaging and funny in terms of the writing for the most part, and also an interesting look at the 16th and early 17th centuries and like the court and things and religion at that time period. However, I found that it was more interesting when I was reading it in very short snippets on my train ride to work than it was when I tried to like sit down and actually read it for consecutive periods of time. I found that I got very strained and very bored, and like found it very difficult to keep going with. I found that I wasn't interested in reading the next bit, and I don't know if that is in part because I am unwell right now and maybe I'm struggling to like pay attention. Annoyingly, I did have the audiobook of this. I returned it because I was like, oh, I'm reading the physical book and I'm getting on with that fine, and I have audiobooks for all the other ones, and now I wish I hadn't done that because the ending of this, it took me so long to read. And I think, yeah, it's hard for me to say it's definitely because of the book when it could in a large part be because I'm not feeling well. It's so hard with non-fiction how different all the subject matters are for these. There's not been that much interest that I can compare them in terms of like the way that they've constructed the narrative or anything. All of them that have been narrative have been very linear. I finished it. I did it. Oh. I have begun my fourth time we drowned, which is by Sally Hayden. And Sally Hayden is a journalist who has been working to free refugees. Particularly at the start of this book, she's talking about Eritrean refugees, the European response to this, the policy response to the migrant crisis, and also the Libyan slave trade and the smuggling of people, and also like life in Eritrea and what it's like. That's what we've kind of covered as she follows certain refugees. She was a journalist who worked on something about Syrian refugees, so these refugees found out about her and was contacting her from inside a detention centre in Libya. What is interesting about listening to the audiobook, there is a section which was interspersed voices from refugees who, whilst they were in detention, like recordings of them talking to her on the phone and things like that, were scattered throughout, and I thought that that was very powerful, very moving. I haven't actually looked in to see how that's done in the book yet. So far, I think she is very, like, obviously angry, and it's very obvious why she's angry. The damage that European policies have done, and been witness to so much inhumane violence and heard so much inhumane violence, and she obviously wants things to change and is attempting to do that in part through this book. I have found the bits where she talks about the experiences of people in the camps very difficult. They've made me feel very uncomfortable, and I'm trying to work out why that is, why I feel more comfortable with the bits that are telling more like the geopolitical story and like the stories of travelling. It's the descriptions, the sort of detailed descriptions of what's going on and the repetitive descriptions. I understand why they're there, because obviously reading the description is nothing like experiencing it. They are obviously powerful because I'm having an emotional response to them. I'm just feeling a little uncomfortable with the way that they're being portrayed, and I don't know if that discomfort is from myself, from me wanting to look away from this difficult thing, or if it's discomfort with the way that it's being done in the book. It feels like invasive for the people who went through this. Probably it's a combination of both of those things. I'm not sure how effective it is, if that's what it's trying to do. I feel like it could cause people to turn away, and I haven't sorted out my thoughts about that yet when I'm coming to you, so I definitely will keep reading, keep listening to the audiobook, and I will come back to you with some more thoughts. So I am halfway through my fourth time we drowned now. The sort of relentless descriptions of atrocities have stopped, and it's turned more into the politics of everything, and the sort of at higher levels in terms of the involvement of UNHCR, is that what they're called? And the corruption involved there. All living in luxury when they're supposed to be helping refugees. I'm glad that it has gone away from the discomfort, and I think it did end up being the right level, because when I was talking to you last about it, I was like, I don't know if this is the right message wrongly worded, in a way. I'm sure that the thing about non-fiction is that I feel like my opinion doesn't change that much throughout the course of a book. But we'll see how we go. I have now finished my fourth time we drowned by Sally Hayden, and I did really enjoy is definitely the wrong word for this book, but I found it really powerful and really moving. She does expand out into kind of policy and the ways that people, including the UN and the EU, are actively harming migrants and not living up to their that they are supposed to be treating refugees, but it does go back and again into various different people's experience of travelling across the Mediterranean, and also of being held in detention in Libya, and what happened to refugees held in detention in Libya when Libya broke out into war again, and also of refugees in Rwanda, as the EU had started to send migrants there, and refugees who had been voluntarily sent home by the EU, and how much that is actually voluntary. And I thought it was very, very powerful. It's definitely a book that's made me want to act, which I think is what I wanted from a book like this. One thing to know about it in the abstract, and another to hear the voices of refugees themselves as they describe what is going on. And also Sally herself had such a close relationship to this story, and I think that that made it more powerful as well. I would be interested in learning more about the UNHCR and the EU and that part of it as well, because be interested in seeing from their perspective, or perhaps a more like investigative journalism piece on that. Very powerful and really well done, the way that she cuts back and forth, and like I said, she takes you right to the edge of your discomfort, like until the point where you feel like I can't handle this anymore. Makes it more procedural from there to give you kind of space and breathing room as a reader, so that it doesn't become incredibly overwhelming. Call to action or a way to help would have been something that I would have liked from this book. It does make you feel quite overwhelmed and quite like there is no hope, and even the people who are supposed to help are actually corrupt, and so there's not much you can do. So I wish there had been more of that in here, but I suppose that wasn't what the book she was trying to write was. Requires you to do more research if it is something that calls you to action. So whilst I thought it was powerful, I could have used a bit more like practical advice. I have begun, and I'm only about 10% of the way through Legacy of Violence. I feel like quite conflicted about this book, because political, historical non-fiction about the crimes of the British Empire, like that's right in my wheelhouse. That's right the thing that I want to be reading, an interest that I have. I want to be armed with more facts about this, and I think that this book, it seems to be really thoroughly researched and really, really heavy on this is what happened, these are the facts, and this is the way people were talking about things at the time. But it is dense. It is nearly 900 pages in physical copy, which I don't have. I did reserve the physical copy of all of these books at the library, and they haven't. Most of them haven't come in. So it's a 37-hour audiobook. I am listening to it a bit faster, but because it's so dense, it's so difficult for me to listen to. Like last night, I was putting photos into a photo album. So I went travelling with my boyfriend in 2018, 2019. I got the photos printed out for him for his birthday. Beginning of 2022, I got them printed out for him, and I am now finally putting them in a photo album. But I was listening to the audiobook whilst I was doing that, and you would think that putting photos in a photo album doesn't require much like thought process, so it shouldn't have been detracting me from the audiobook, but I kept having to go back. I kept having to restart things because I was like, wait, what's going on now? Where are we now? And I was feeling like it's quite academically written, and that's not necessarily something that I think that's something that you should know going into it. It throws you right in with all the names and the facts, and it does describe who people are, but in like one sentence. It doesn't give you a huge grounding or background. If you've watched any of my video essays on here, you'll know, because I list the sources in the description, that I read journal articles when I am writing those video essays. So I'm not like out of the habit of reading academic stuff, but this is so dense, and so whilst the information is of interest to me, the perspective and the point of view is of interest to me, I think the density of it makes sense for the subject matter, because we are covering like the whole of the British Empire and violence in the British Empire. Well, actually the second British Empire, which I've never heard it called before, but it's like post-American independence. So the first chapter was like a big overview, and I was like, I'm completely lost, and this is going to be so confusing for me. The second chapter was all about the Boer War, and so I think that going more in detail has been more beneficial for me. But yeah, I still feel very overwhelmed. I am about 30% of the way through Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire, and I think I'm going to stop there for this video. As I said earlier, I need this video to go up fairly soon, but also, as I was saying earlier, it is a very dense book, and it is one I think I'm going to have to spend a lot more time reading, and to give it's the space that it requires, rather than trying to read as much of it as possible. It is a very long book and a very complicated history. It is like, I'm enjoying the writing. I think that the writing is well done. I said before it was academic, and it's definitely on the more academic end of popular history, so it's not all the way like reading an academic journal, but it does have a lot of facts and a lot of statistics and a lot of like, it's packed, it's jam-packed. There's not like space, and there's not like analysis really going on. There is kind of, but it's analysis in subtext, so analysis through the way that the facts are stacked and through the ways that you are shown what went on. It's very like clear-eyed, rather than being very personal. Like the Katherine Rundell book, you could very much tell how much she liked John Donne, and I kind of found that off-putting, whereas this book is not trying to give you the Caroline's perspective, it's just going through the facts, and it's obviously it's laying them out in a way to structure an argument, but it's not overly giving you this is the way that you have to interpret this, and I think that that's really good. But I don't think I'm going to be able to finish it for a while. I think it's a book that's going to take me time to like actually get through, and I'm going to have to give myself chapters at a time and then give myself space to allow things to settle, and possibly reread parts of it again to make sure that I've properly like understood. I understand the general argument, but to make sure I understand the specifics, I feel like sometimes I'll need to go over it again because there isn't like a narrative through line. So I think probably out of all of the books, I haven't finished it, but it is my favourite one out of all 6 of them, but I still haven't finished it, so I can't say for definite that it's my favourite, but I feel like it's going to be. The one that out of all the ones I finished that's my favourite is My Fourth Time We Drowned. So those are the best 6 non-fiction this year apparently. Like I said, I think Legacy of Violence is going to be my favourite, but I do think that My Fourth Time We Drowned is my favourite of the ones that I finished. A Fortunate Woman to be a little insipid, and it didn't really go into inequalities in healthcare. It felt like easy Sunday afternoon read, like something to buy one of your grandparents. They would probably enjoy it, but I don't feel like it really did have a perspective, and it felt like it was missing a lot out. It felt like it was avoiding conversations, so that was probably my least favourite. And like I said, with the John Donne, I could see how much Katherine Rundell really liked him, and I felt like it was a little too sycophantic and a little too fawning. And The Restless Republic, I've already forgotten. Like, it was fine, it was a great, if that's an area of history that you want to learn about and you need a primer for it, I think it was a perfectly fine one to go for, but it wasn't something that's really going to stick with me. I definitely preferred last year's Baillie Gifford Shortlist to this year's one, but I guess that's the nature of the beast. When you're something as broad as non-fiction, there's a lot there that could be considered to be the best, so I'm glad I did this again, even if it has taken me twice as long as I thought it would. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do let me know what you thought in the comments down below, and I will make sure to get back to you soon with another video. I put out new videos twice a week, so do remember to give this one a thumbs up and to subscribe, and I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.